Hey, welcome back to Fish on Northwest. Got a full studio now, definitely. Julia Smith, thank you so much for coming. Glad you were here.
Thank you so much for having me.
It's our pleasure, trust me. Tom, nice to see you again, man.
Good to see you guys too.
Yeah. Great that we got some blacktail to talk about.
Yeah.
Do you have a seminar coming up?
I do not. I actually have no seminars this fall set up.
How's Wayne going to kill a deer?
How am I going to kill deer?
You have to do a private seminar?
Yeah.
He needs all the help he can get.
Well, we can talk.
This is true.
Just tell me where your cameras are and we'll figure it out.
Okay. You will be happy to know I've elevated this year. I'm up in a tree platform versus ground blind for blacktail.
Okay.
So I'm not out on a foot as you would be, but
So you're up in your game a little bit.
Yeah, I'm up in my game.
Good deal.
No pun
Literally.
intended. Yeah, literally. Julia Smith, WDFW Wolf Coordinator. I told you when you hit the front step there, I go, you're a hard lady to find. She keeps it, her social media platform is pretty underground. So
I'm new in Washington, so
yes,
you may not have the presence. So.
Let's just real quickly remind folks of that. So previously, 5 years or so down Arizona, New Mexico, wolf management, your position there, and what were you doing with wolves down there?
Sure. I worked for the Arizona Game and Fish Department, and I was most recently employed there as the field supervisor for the state of Arizona. So I was managing our field team, directing all the field activities in the state of Arizona, and doing all the population monitoring, wolf collaring, trapping, following them around, keeping them away from livestock, working with livestock producers to prevent conflict, basically driving around in a field truck all day, and it was a great job.
You liked it?
I loved it.
And you had sunny weather.
Oh, yeah. I missed that.
Real quickly, just a little history in that regard for that area that you were working. So wolves were completely exterminated out of the area back when?
Oh gosh, so their history is quite a bit different from wolves in Washington.
Okay.
So I want to make sure that we don't conflate the two.
Sure.
So this is just your wolves in the Southwest. That's Arizona, New Mexico, and even Mexico actually. They were completely eradicated, and the last 5 animals were trapped from the wild in Mexico, put in captivity, and then the entire wild population that exists today in Arizona and New Mexico comes from those individuals.
Is that right?
So it's a totally different situation from what we have here in Washington.
So they basically bred those in captivity and repopulated the landscape with wolves.
That's right.
A full-on recovery plan of capture of what remained in the wild and built the program to where it is today. When you left, do you know what the population was down there?
Yeah, it was 117 individuals minimum, and then their most recent minimum count was 131, so right in line with where Washington is.
Okay.
Only it divides the 2 states, Arizona and New Mexico. It's about right along the state line.
Genetically, any difference in those wolves,
yes,
right?
quite a bit different.
Quite a bit, yeah.
Washington's wolves are genetically robust, healthy. There's genetic interchange among several different populations.
Yeah.
It's not the case for Mexican wolves in Arizona and New Mexico. That's a closed population, and so those animals are incredibly genetically inbred, and they face recovery challenges that we don't have here in Washington.
These wolves up here are bigger?
They are bigger.
Not? Yeah.
Yep.
Okay, so little history from down there, just so folks know that this isn't your first wolf rodeo just coming up here to Washington.
I'm new to Washington, but I am not new to wolves.
So I wanted to make sure people understand that. What in the heck would draw you from the sunny warmth of the South to come up to Washington State and manage wolves?
I can't believe. Okay, we've got the mountains, we've got the ocean, we've got the rivers, we've got the forest. I mean, do I need to say anything else? This is the most beautiful state I've ever seen. And I came here some years back and wasn't here for very long, but it left a deep impression on me. I always thought if I had the chance to move here, I would do it. Perfect.
So WDFW since about November of last year, or November, December, if I'm remembering right?
I came on in November last year.
You were hired as the WDFW Wolf Coordinator, correct?
I was. It's a new position, and it was hired mostly to work on processes around writing environmental planning documents for processes like wolf translocation and wolf post-recovery planning.
Gotcha.
But generally, you can say I work on wolf policy.
Okay. So I kind of covered that the wolves were pretty much eradicated and trapped and rebuilt the program down south. Let's talk a little history on the misconception here in Washington State. Barnum and I joke about this all the time. Everybody thinks that WDFW had this huge cage and they took it out there in the middle of the mountains on the northeast quadrant of our state, and they opened it up and set the wolves free and said, we now have wolves.
I've heard all sorts of stories from black helicopters to black Suburbans. To,
Oh, yeah.
I mean, we've heard it all, and these were midnight.
Yeah.
You can't talk about it, and they killed witnesses and all this stuff. So, what's the true story of the timeline of the wolf in Washington State? Take us down that timeline.
Sure. Well, let's go way back, right? Let's go back through the history of the state. Wolves are native in Washington. They used to exist in the state statewide. People say, how do you know that? There are excellent records, actually mostly through trapping and bounty records, because bounties on wolves are, in a lot of the states, some of the first laws that were ever enacted in state governments and county governments were actually wolf bounties. So there's bounty records for wolves across the state, from the western coast, the Olympic Peninsula, all the way to the east side. So we do know that wolves were native in the state, and they're also surrounded by other places that have native wolf populations: Canada, the Rocky Mountains, down into the rest of the Pacific Northwest, Oregon, California. So that's the history. So in the 1850s up through 1900s, that was the years that during settlement of this area, when wolves were basically hunted to extinction, trapped out, bounties, that kind of thing. They were eradicated from the state. And so the last known wolf in the state, so they were disappeared by the 1930s.
Do they know, or do they have a guess, perhaps, what the populations of the wolves would have been back in the turn of the 1900s?
There's, to my knowledge, there aren't good estimates of that. You can read some estimates. Probably our best resource on that really historical information is Young and Goldman, 1946. They wrote 2 pretty comprehensive volumes of wolf records. And although there's a lot of things missing, like how many wolves did the state support, we don't have good records of that. But if you want to read some of their initial accounts of what was on the landscape, and not just in Washington, but across the nation, that's your best resource. And those are way old, out of print, but you can find them if you're lucky in some bookstores. But anyway, so wolves are gone in the state by the 1930s. And then around the early 1990s, there were rumblings of dispersing animals coming to the state, lone wolves coming through, and reports that probably were legitimate, but states count a population when they document breeding in the state. And so the first breeding pack wasn't documented until 2008, although we know probably there was wolf presence here earlier than that, but you actually have to document, okay, is this a pair, does it have pups?
Right, and I think that's important to put out there, because I see all the time also is hunters saying, well, I saw a wolf on this and I reported it, and the state denies whether or not they're there, and they're lying to us. They know they're there, but they won't say it. But you guys have guidelines you have to follow before you confirm a wolf is in that area or a pack is in that area, correct?
Exactly, and there's definitions of what all these things mean. A pack has a definition. That's 2 or more animals traveling together. A breeding pair has a definition. That's 2 or more animals that it's a pair, right? But they have to have at least 2 offspring that survive to the end of the year. And so you might look at a group of 4 wolves and say, okay, that's a breeding pair just based on what we know of wolf biology. But these things do have definitions. And so maybe we'll show our pack map later on, or you can see where they are. But that doesn't mean that you can never see a wolf anywhere else in the state. Wolves can travel hundreds of miles, and the real truth is that you could possibly see a wolf anywhere in the state. Now, does that mean that they're a resident? Does that mean that they live there? Does that mean they hold a territory there? Does that mean they raise young there? No, not necessarily.
Question coming in here from Matt Berger. He's curious if genetically the wolves that we have now would genetically be linked to the wolves that were here in the early 1900s, late 1800s.
So that's a tough question to answer, because we've lost so many animals since then. But I think the simplest answer is yes. So there's a lot of debate among scientists about how many subspecies of wolves were there, and especially in Washington, a big topic is whether there was a coastal wolf that was different, that rely on salmon, like you see in the Alexander Archipelago, and whether that same wolf existed here. So there's a lot of talk about how many different subspecies there are, but there's not debate about what species was here, and that's the gray wolf. And so that gray wolf lived all the way up from Canada, all the way south into Mexico. So even that wolf of the Southwest, it's a different subspecies, but it's still a gray wolf, Canis lupus. And so those animals, although there would have been gradations and differences as you change in climate and terrain and prey adaptations, all that kind of stuff, sure, there's local adaptations, but it is one species, Canis lupus.
Right, because another thing that we hear a lot of times is the wolves that were reintroduced to the West, which they are a different breed of wolf. They're a bigger wolf, stronger wolf. They take more feed. So you're saying that's not actually the case.
And
this is the same genetic string of wolf that would have been here 100 years ago.
Right, and that's a connected population.
Right.
So that one's a myth, and also, if that's what folks think, well, our wolves in Washington are, a normal male is 90 pounds, normal female is about 80 pounds. So that's not a monster wolf. That's just a normal wolf.
Yeah.
And that's your average here.
A 160-pound wolf can take down an elk by itself. Yeah.
Right.
They're here.
Right.
Well, and I would say probably what you'll notice is, and you probably know the name of the science behind that, but as you move farther north, species begin to grow larger. So it only makes sense that the wolf in this area wouldn't be the 200-pound wolf that you have in the Yukon.
Well, and again, this critter, there's gradations. Think historically, if you have an animal that exists across all of North America, think about the differences that you'd see. Just like the same differences we see in elk, deer population.
I mean, I've been in northern Alberta, and these whitetails are absolute giants.
Sure.
And you go to southern Arizona, and Coues deer,
Little
cows
tiny
deer,
guys.
Little tiny guys.
Yeah, little dudes. So, I mean, and even blacktails, we see the difference between California deer and Oregon, Willamette Valley, and even up here into the peninsula, and even in antler configuration. So, genetically, same animal. Geographically, adaptations. I mean, that's just what you see.
Adaptations and evolution specific to their region. Obviously, right? So, couple things referencing the recovery plan. So, was it at 2008? I'm looking at a graph here that shows me a population from 2008. We had 5 up to now 2018 when that was recorded 126. So, prior to 2008. As you mentioned, like in the 90s, there were sightings. People say, I'm pretty sure I saw a wolf, right? Was it when WDFW field biologists were out there looking, putting in time, actually found and documented breeding pair to say, hey, we have 5 wolves that we've confirmed. Now we're going to track these wolves and keep track of them and what's going on. Is that when then efforts were put in to develop a recovery plan, or was it prior to that? It
was actually prior to that.
Okay.
The process to start began in 2007. And so the state was being a little proactive there, saying, okay, we've got to have a wolf conservation and management plan. We know these animals are coming into the state.
Right.
Obviously, wolves, wherever they exist in this country, are a controversial species. So we need to have guidelines that will guide how we manage them here in the state of Washington. So that plan started development in 2007, and it took till 2011. So it took 5 years to develop, and that process was guided by a stakeholder group as well, at that time called the Wolf Working Group, that consisted of stakeholders including environmentalists, livestock producers, hunters, and those without affiliations. And so it's a long involved process to develop a wolf plan that works for everybody.
As it's moving forward now, obviously, the numbers have varied a little bit. As we were talking prior to the show, the state has removed 9 from the landscape this year alone due to problems with a handful of different issues over in that northeast quadrant. So it would seem that it's hard to manage the wolves to get to that recovery plan goal if we have to keep eliminating them.
So.
What is the recovery plan?
That's a great question. So again, wolf mortality is actually modeled in that 2011 Wolf Conservation and Management Plan, and you actually have to reach a certain percentage of mortality. I think it's 28% before you start seeing dips. So agency removal of wolves is actually, we consider an impact to recovery before moving forward on any of those actions. And if you look again at the last 10 years, you see an upward trajectory that actually represents an average of 28% growth per year. Now, is that steady growth? No, certainly in the early years you see faster growth as wolves recolonize open habitat.
Right.
In the more recent years there's some slower growth, but again it's an average of 28%, and we see that as an upward trajectory not only in number of individual wolves but also packs and breeding pairs.
Gotcha.
And we also see distribution of wolves in the state moving westward, and this year is actually the first year that a wolf pack was documented west of the Cascade Crest since extirpation from the state. So that's a huge
That
deal.
happened this year in 2019?
That happened to 2018.
Oh, 2018.
As of the last survey.
Okay.
Yep.
Okay. Well, that's kind of exciting.
Yeah.
Back up a little bit for people, and we always talk about wolf delisting in Washington. What are those 3 zones, and where do we have to be criteria-wise in those 3 zones before we can even talk about management of wolves?
Yeah, great question. So the 2011 Conservation and Management Plan shows 3 different zones. You've got Eastern Washington, you've got Northern Cascades, and then you've got Southern Cascades and the Western Coast. And so that those 3 zones, according to the plan, to get to the stage where you could down or delist wolves, each of those recovery zones has to have a minimum of 4 breeding pairs plus 3 anywhere in the state for a minimum of 3 years, 3 consecutive years, or 4 in each zone plus 6 anywhere in the state for a minimum of 1 year. And so in the Eastern Recovery Zone, that's where the majority of the wolves in the state live. That's where almost all of them live.
Right.
There were 12 breeding pairs in that zone. So that is 3 times the regional component of that recovery objective.
Right.
And then you've got 3 in that Northern Cascades recovery zone. So 1 more until you have that objective of 4 breeding pairs.
Right.
And then the Southern Cascades and Northwest Coast, wolves just haven't got to yet. And that's not to say that they aren't around.
Right.
The individual wolves don't disperse there. So if folks have seen wolves, that is absolutely possible. Wolves disperse hundreds of miles and you could see them. But in order for us to document those breeding pairs, we need to actually have wolves holding territory and
Breeding.
Yeah, and breeding. Exactly.
And then you can count them. Yeah.
Exactly. And I
Yeah.
think it's just that they haven't got there yet.
Sure.
I don't
Right.
think it's anything preventing them,
So
but they haven't done it
you're
yet.
seeing that cluster of population in the northeast corner. Do you feel that the migration from there across the rest of the state has happened in the time that you guys figured it would, or is it going slower than what you expect or quicker?
It's an interesting question. So the original plan, again, the model, the population model that gives us our prediction said it should happen by 2021.
Okay.
So we're not there yet. It's 19.
Okay.
So when 2021 happens, will we be there? I don't know the
Hard to
answer to
say.
that
Right.
question.
Yeah.
It's kind of a
Okay,
crystal
good.
ball. But I think all of our biologists in the state are confident that it will happen. I'm confident that it will happen. Will it happen by 2021? I don't know that.
Right.
Let's. We're going to hover right there for a bit. We're at a point where we understand we have an uptick of average of 28% per year. We have a goal that was originally put into the plan in 2011 for 2021 to hopefully meet our goals in the 3 quadrants that we've recognized for the numbers of breeding pair that we need. We're going to tie all that in. Also want to talk age of wolves, like average age, lifespan expectancy. It's going to be a lot lower than most of you think.
And do they breed like rats?
Do they breed like rats? Multiple litters a year? Like a puppy pound. There's a lot of things involving numbers. I want to kind of get all that lumped into a package here that I think we can do. So we're going to jump out for a quick break. We're going to take a little break from the wolf talk, and we're going to jump in the bait lab. Break down for you a simple rigging process for finding success going out bobber dogging for coho. If you are simply throwing plugs, pitching spinners, or twitching jigs, you're probably finding some fish, but you may be surprised on certain rivers how good the egg bite is for coho. If you're not doing it, you're missing out. I'm going to show you how to set up and be productive bobber dogging for coho. We come back right here on FHM.